Thank you very much. And so for our fourth keynote speech, it is my pleasure to have in person Professor Takehiko Matsugi, who is the professor and based at the National Museum of Japanese History, who will be giving a talk on cultural transformation of the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago in the ancient world system centered on the Han Dynasty. Thank you.
Good afternoon and 안녕하세요. I am Takehiko Matsugi from the National Museum of Japanese History, and I'm working on Japanese archaeology and cognitive or evolutionary archaeology. Today, I am very honored to read a paper on this SEAA plenary session. I will talk about cultural transformation of the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago in the ancient world system centered on the Han Dynasty. The purpose of this paper is to clarify how the stimulus from the Han Dynasty changed the prehistoric societies of the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. However, since I am mainly studying the Japanese archaeology, I apologize in advance for the fact that the analysis on the Japanese archipelago will be the main focus. I will occasionally mention the Korean Peninsula. First, I would like to confirm where the Han Dynasty era is positioned in the process of social change in the prehistoric periods of the Japanese archipelago. Japanese archaeology has various types of periodization. The most common one is the domestic periodization, which is only applicable to the Japanese archipelago, shown in the top row. In this periodization, the Han Dynasty era corresponds to the Yayoi period. Yayoi is said to be the period from the beginning of paddy rice cultivation to the appearance of cocoon, that is, huge buried mounds. The Han Dynasty age corresponds to the latter half of the Yayoi period. Also, it corresponds to the beginning of the Iron Age in the more general periodization. In the anthropological stage, many researchers dedicate to chiefdom. And this is important, but I think the Yayoi period is ancient times in the historical division of world history. Many Japanese researchers consider the later Nara period and later to be ancient times, and the Yayoi period is much earlier than it. I would like to mention this problem later. In any case, the Han Dynasty was a time when metal objects became widespread in the Japanese archipelago. Stratification progressed rapidly, and society changed drastically towards the next stage. Let me see how the contact with the Han Dynasty changed the society of Japanese archipelago. The Japanese archipelago during the Han Dynasty is the time when the cultural claim becomes most clear from the west to the east, taking earthenware, which is the most basic material culture. As an example, northern Kyushu at the western end used the plain and functional earthenware, as in China and the Korean peninsula. Around here, plain and functional pottery is spread. In contrast, on the other hand, in the northeastern region around here, pottery with complicated patterns, which drawed on the German tradition was used. I call them Germanish pottery. And while metalware was already widespread in the western end around northern Kyushu, whereas stone tools were still used in the northern region. By the way, although it may deviate from the side street, the green line in the figure on the left is the line of Yayoi culture, the domain of Yayoi culture set by Japanese archaeologists. But can it be archaeologically recognized that the inside of the line is the same culture? How can you say this is the same culture? The pottery is different, and the material of the tools are completely different, and the appearance of society is also different. People around northern Kyushu were perfectly farmers, and the people around northeastern area around here, northwestern region around here, almost hunters and gatherers. The reason for ignoring it and making it the same culture is the existence of rice paddy fields. The concept of yayoi comes from the mythical expression of Japan's ancient appearance as a country where rice grows abundantly, Toyo Ashihara no Mizuho no Kuni. However, paddy fields are also on the Korean peninsula at the same time. Therefore, it is not archaeologically appropriate for the green line to separate the Japanese archipelago from the Korean peninsula. This line only represents the border between modern Japan and Korea. Therefore, I think the concept of yayoi should be abandoned. Maybe I'm destroying Japanese archaeology. Let's back to the story. In northern Kyushu, where functional earthenware and metalware were popular, a lot of cultural materials from the Han Dynasty flowed in via Luran, such as mirrors, coffin fittings, and stone discs, and so on. In other words, I think that northern Kyushu, which is located at the western end of the archipelago, became civilized through contact with the Han Dynasty. And this brought the Japanese archipelago into an ancient stage. The most important artifact is the gold shell, as shown here. It is highly possible that the gold shield was given in 57 AD by the Eastern Han Emperor. The gold shield indicates that the Han Dynasty has incorporated the western end of the Japanese archipelago into the political system. As a result, the Japanese archipelago was incorporated into the margin of the ancient world system centered on the Han Dynasty. However, the direct influence of the Han Dynasty can be seen only in northern Kyushu, and the influence diminished as it goes east. The cultural climate I mentioned earlier is a manifestation of that. Before and after the Han Dynasty, the weights and measure system, writing, and coinage were introduced into the Japanese archipelago from China, and in some cases via the Korean peninsula. All of these suggest that new thinking patterns with high-level abstraction and quantification of values have begun to change Japanese archipelago society. Dr. Andrew Hutchison and I myself have been arguing in recent years that this new or so-called thinking technique has spread worldwide and changed human history during this period. In other words, a new cognitive system was evoked to be on the surface of the thinking of the people in the society. I'm showing the stone weights from Kamei site from Osaka Prefecture. They show weights according to a certain sequence. This is the lightest weight, and 2 times, 4 times, 8 times, 16 times, and 32 times. 4 stages of weights aligned. We found from the stone weights from Kamei sites. And the central figure, it's inkstone and letters written with a brush from Kawayama site, Shimane Prefecture. This is from 1st century BC. Whether it is really characters is still under discussion, but a high possibility. And these are the Huang coins. Sorry, okay. The mainstream idea was that coins were imported as bullion for making bronzeware. But in recent years, more and more people think that it has been circulated as real money. Let's take a closer look at the chiefdom of Northern Kyushu, which was created on the edge of the ancient world system centered on the Han Dynasty. 2 large settlements have emerged in the coastal area, Mikumo and Sugu, which have become the gateways for diplomacy with China and the Korean peninsula. Influential people based in such settlements could monopolize diplomatic rights with China and imported goods such as mirrors, strengthening their authority as representatives or leaders of the communities, and by giving some of the mirrors to the inland chiefs. They formed confederated chiefdom that politically incorporated them. It is the first political society in the Japanese archipelago stimulated from Han Dynasty. Next, I would like to talk about the decline of the Han Dynasty and the collapse of the ancient world system. It has been pointed out that the society of the Japanese archipelago was confused and reorganized from the latter half of the 4th century AD to the 2nd century AD. For example, the conflict of chiefdoms in northern Kyushu, just mentioned, confederation of the chiefdoms in northern Kyushu, just mentioned, disappeared. At least archaeologically, in the second half of the 1st century. Also, in Kinki region to the east, it has been pointed out that the population may have decreased and dispersed because large settlements were disappeared and the number of tombs decreased during the period. In recent years, more and more researchers have argued that climate change is the cause. In Japan, many archaeological and historical researchers, led by Professor Takeshi Nakatsuka of Nagoya University, have formed a big project team, including me, over the past 10 years to restore high precision paleoclimatology using the oxygen isotope ratio of trailing cellulose. According to the result, it was found that rapid cooling and moistening here, this yellow arrow, in the 1st century BC. This is likely to have had a major impact on agricultural production, especially in the Japanese archipelago, which creates paddy fields in the lowland. The global cooling of the climate after AD is estimated from overseas paleoclimate studies. In world history, in the hundreds of years after the era, the ancient empires, including the Han Dynasty and Rome, declined, and the systems centered on them collapsed in various places when the central part of the system did not function sufficiently. Ethnic groups in the Japanese archipelago, the Korean peninsula, or marginal areas such as northwestern Europe increased their independence and power. This is so-called Great Immigration at the western end of Eurasia. And it is thought that the same thing happened in this East Asia, including the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. It was a time when the ethnic groups on the periphery became politically independent and competed with each other towards the state formation. I consider this period a transition from ancient times to the Middle Ages. Furthermore, the cocoon period, which follows the Yayoi period, was previously considered to be the prestige of the ancient state. But for the above reasons, I propose to consider it as an early medieval state. The chiefdom of the periphery area, which began to emerge in this way, intensified negotiations both in terms of competition, sometimes including warfare, and peaceful trade. At this time, the chiefdom of the Japanese archipelago strengthened its relationship with the chiefdom of the southern part of the Korean peninsula, rather than the remote center of China. This has further increased the status of the chief, who was the representative of this competition and trade. The chiefs of the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago, who have increased their power in this way, began to build large burial mounds and compete their own authority. This movement is common to the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. On the Korean peninsula, rather than a large mound, the burial developed in the direction of showing off prestige by offering a large amount of burial goods in elaborated coffins. The rich wooden chamber tombs of Beohan and Jinhan are typical examples. On the other hand, in the Japanese archipelago, large burial mounds developed earlier. The reason for this will be explained later. At the next stage, the chiefs of the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago will form the core of the regime, with the chiefs who have succeeded more by accumulating trade and military power as paramount chiefs, or kings and queens. In the Japanese archipelago, chiefs in Yamato district, who are at the core of both agricultural production and trade, became the king or queen and came to control a wide range of local chiefs. Chief in Yamato constructed the largest mounds and performed the most complex and splendid rituals. Local chiefs imitated it in a reduced form. In the Korean peninsula, the same movement proceeded earlier or later than in the Japanese archipelago, depending on the region. Kings appeared in Kogyo, Baekje, Shilla, and Kaya regions, each of which began to develop towards the formation of early medieval states. These emerging states, including the Japanese archipelago, continued to maintain close relationship in terms of competition, including warfare and peaceful trade, exchanging various materials, information, and sometimes even human resources. This can be seen from the fact that the burial mounds in each region developed into unique styles, but had a high degree of commonality in the basic structure and contents of grave goods. I call the archaeological situation in which the emerging states of Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago competitively build burial mounds, which show both commonality and individuality as East Asian burial mound culture. I have advocated it in Japanese archaeology, although few people have followed that. Anyway, among these, Japanese mounds have a very remarkable character. It is to be extremely larger than any other area. I don't think this has anything to do with the degree of economic power of the chief. A big hint to the elucidation was from the research of Professor Lee, Sanju, one of the executive, one of the leading persons of the conference. Professor Lee divided the mounded tombs into two kinds due to its structure. One is to install coffins first and build a mound on them. This is called pondumyo. The other is to build a mound first and then install coffins on the top of them. This is called pungyumyo. In the Korean peninsula, both are mixed in each region, but in SEAA and Kaya, pondumyo was the mainstream. On the contrary, the mound of the Japanese archipelago were almost pungyumyo, apart from the last phase of the cocoon period. In the Japanese archipelago, it is considered that the higher the status of the person to be buried, the higher the burial had to be situated in their worldview. A high-ranking person, such as king, has to be buried higher than any other chief in order to show its authority. For that, a high mound was needed. So the higher the mound, the larger it had to be. I believe that these values and the emulation between chiefs have made the burial mounds of Japanese archipelago usually large. Let me come to conclusion. During the Han Dynasty period, from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, especially in the first half of the period, an ancient world system centered on it was formed in East Asia. This gave a strong stimulus to the society of the Korean peninsula located in the middle part and the Japanese archipelago located in the marginal part, and accelerated the process of social integration in the two regions. I think this is ancient ages. The ancient world system appears archaeologically as a strong cultural claim, especially in the Japanese archipelago. On the periphery, a steep climb from the west to the east appeared at this time. After the 2nd century AD, this climb diminished and a new center was created in Kinki. And there appeared many centers also on the Korean peninsula. These centers were strengthened toward the formation of states through repeated competition and exchange. This is the Three Kingdom Age of the Korean peninsula and the cocoon period of the Japanese archipelago, and archaeologically, it appears as East Asian burial mound culture. Similar movements were underway in northwestern Europe at the western end of Eurasia. I would like to advocate that this should be regarded as the beginning of the Middle Ages in world history. Thank you for your attention. 감사합니다.